Okay, if I look a little bit disheveled or behave a bit low energy, it's because after 2 years of being careful, Madam COVID finally found me. And she is a cruel mistress. I also nicked myself shaving. So, when my voice sounds like this, what a better time than now to talk about such a sensual and sexy book, with a sensual and sexy me. Briefly, A Delicious Life has jumped to the middle of my top 10 books of this year so far, which I mentioned in a previous video. I absolutely adore this book. I am thrilled that I learned about it. This is Nell Stevens' debut piece of fiction, although she is already a very accomplished writer of non-fiction and memoir. And oh my god, this is a wonderful piece of fiction. First up, I should say, if you are a fan of Maggie O'Farrell's Hamnet, which I absolutely am, you're probably going to love this book because it comes at historical fiction from a similar angle in terms of its tone and its approach to character writing and setting and general vibe, which I'm going to do my best to try and describe when I feel like this. However, Hamnet wasn't particularly sexy, and this is a very sexy book for two reasons. One, it's got a lot of sex in it. Not a lot of sex, but the characters are in love, and they're horny. But the other reason is just there's a sense of sensuality and sexuality to it, which comes through, I think, even in the cover design. This cover pretty much captures the general vibe of the book. Sensuality can be explored in lots of different ways. There are difficulties when it comes to defining sexiness and sensuality, and this book manages to do that in some really interesting ways. Quite a while ago, I watched a video from Philosophy Tube about beauty, and in it she talks about this photographer who captures a bunch of black and white photos of naked human bodies, and then takes pretty much the same photos of peppers, and the peppers look more sexy than the bodies. And she talks about why, or at least attempts to, in that video. I'll link it in the description. I don't remember it that well, but the peppers really stayed in my head as something that looked particularly sexy. And there is a sensuality and sexiness to the way that this book is conveyed. As for what briefly A Delicious Life is about, we begin with the ghost of a girl who lives in a charter house in Mallorca. It's the Victorian period, and she's already been dead for about 500 years. After she died, she came to realize that she was into girls, that she is a gay ghost. That's not something I ever thought I'd say. And through the years, the decades, the centuries, women have come and gone, and she has found herself obsessed with them, falling in love with them over and over again, watching them live and grow old and die, and she has remained. Now, it's 18-something, and Chopin, Frédéric Chopin, the Polish composer, has arrived at this charter house in Mallorca with his love interest, let's say, the French author George Sand. Now, much like Hamnet, you've got a very, very famous male protagonist in this story who is not really the protagonist. Chopin is the most famous person in this story, but he takes a back seat just like Shakespeare did in Hamnet. In this book, Chopin has consumption, and George Sand has taken him, along with her own two children, to this charter house, to Mallorca, to take in the air, to try to get better, to enjoy the relaxation, the good food, and the scenery, and just heal. But George Sand is very much our protagonist, as is the ghost of this girl. George Sand herself was a real French author who, when I first read this, I'd never heard of before. And doing a little bit of very light Googling and wiki reading, it looks like she was actually a really prolific author during the Victorian period, and in fact, at least in the UK, she outsold authors like Victor Hugo. For some reason, Brits really resonated with her stories. George Sand used to dress in masculine clothing in order to try to get into the spaces that men could go in and generally have more public freedom. So she was a very daring character in that way. And her fiction was hugely successful at the time, and yet I've never heard anyone talk about it. I've never studied her, I never hear anyone talk about her, and now I really want to read some of her stories, which I assume must be very easily accessible these days. But in this novel, she and Chopin are having a love affair, and the two of them, along with her kids, have ended up at this charter house in Mallorca, and our narrator, our eyes and ears, are this ghost, who is able to do a few clever supernatural things, like dig into the memories of these characters and learn more about them, which means that about half of this book is actually flashbacks to George Sand's childhood, or her career thus far, her life thus far, as well as Chopin's a little bit, and her own, the ghosts. And then the rest is what happens on Mallorca while they're there, how Chopin gets more ill, how the locals don't trust these French foreigners who've come in and are clearly sick and diseased and polluting the island. And there's a little bit of torches and pitchforks-ness going on that's fun and scary in equal parts. The perspective of the ghost is something that's truly unique here. The fact that she's able to dig into people's memories means that we're able to have flashbacks that are all kind of diegetic. They're all part of the narrative rather than just flitting us about willy-nilly as the author chooses. It all feels like it is part of the grander narrative. It's all part of a scheme. It is consistent. She's also able to kind of go into the bodies of people and not really manipulate them, but also kind of. Not in a puppeteer way, but sort of a suggestive way, like a Jedi mind trick or something. And that allows for some goofy hijinks occasionally and ways to avoid dangerous situations. She's trying to help George because she has become very, very quickly obsessed with George the second she saw her. Her breath was taken away by this, what she first thinks is a young man, a very feminine young man who then turns out to be a young woman. As for the sensuality that I kept alluding to at the beginning, this is explored in some really interesting ways. First of all, it's the scenery. It's a beautiful, beautiful place that is wonderfully described and brought to life by the author's language. But then it's also the general atmosphere and what these characters get up to. There's a lot of breathing room here. There's a lot of moments where not much happens, and we just dig into their past, or we look at what they're doing that day, how they're spending their time. There are some absolutely wonderful moments where Chopin is playing the piano, and our narrator is just watching him and falling in love with the sound itself. And this is incredibly sensual. The way that his fingers are described, the notes themselves, the sounds that are produced. It's all incredibly sensual, and again, it reminded me of those peppers in that Philosophy Tube video. The language that describes these moments is caustic, if that's the right word. I'm not very smart. There is a tangibility to them that really made me feel comforted and understood and connected with in almost a physical way. And that also goes for when she is describing George Sand, her physical appearance, her personality, her background, the way that she talks and walks and moves and thinks and remembers. There is so much love and care and intimacy put into these moments. They're so quiet and yet so loud. Not much is happening, but the passion, the ferocity, the emotion of it is all so engaging. It's like a quiet sexual experience. You're in a quiet room, but the sex is loud, the intimacy is loud, the passion within your body and your mind is on fire. Oh, that made me think of the Kings of Leon. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to remind anyone of the Kings of Leon. Why would I do that? Anyway, that sensuality also comes through with the sex itself. There are moments where Chopin and George Sand are having sex, and there's one particularly descriptive moment where the point of view character, this ghost, remarks that they are having sex like women. And I thought you could interpret this in two different ways. One, that Chopin is physically performing sexual acts that two women would perform in more of a lesbian dynamic, if you like. But that seemed a little bit dry, a little bit boring. Another interpretation is simply that she is remarking that women love in better ways, and perhaps that when a man has sex with a woman, he does it in a more hungry and selfish way. That's kind of how I interpreted it, but I have a lot of internalized sexism towards men. It just made me think that these two people were having an intimate connection that felt more sensual, more emotional than what you might typically get from a straight man and woman. But perhaps lesbian TikTok has influenced my brain in that way. It made me sympathetic towards Chopin. The idea that he loves in the way that a woman does, I romantically attach myself to that, and I thought that was really cool. I don't know if my interpretation is right, and I don't care. That's not really the point. But the sensuality of this book is something to really celebrate. And the publishers, the agent, whoever, all the people that go into creating a book, editors, etc., they clearly understood that because the cover design is just perfectly meshed with the tone and narrative of this book. The fact that it's all narrated by a ghost adds a little bit of fun to it. The fact that we flip back and forth in time through memories of different people, and we also learn about the ghost, how she died, why she died, what her life was like up until that point. It's all very interesting. There's a moment quite early on where she talks about her descendants, how they all still live on this island, and she kind of keeps an eye on them. But she died when she was 14, and I thought, surely she didn't have any kids. You read on, you find out. Her life was a tragedy. There's a lot to dig into in these characters, especially George Sand most of all. Chopin is not thrown aside. He is cared for and considered, but he is also not the focus of this. I'm not even sure if there is a focus. I'm not sure I can say that George Sand is the focus. It's more the general atmosphere, the general relationship between these characters. I was very glued to it. And all the while, I felt a lot of electricity. Almost between me and this fucking book. I felt tension. I felt pride. I felt a lot of interesting emotions that I didn't expect. I'm very grateful to Nell Stevens for creating something so sensual. And I hope I haven't come across too horny while talking about this book, but that's the effect it had. It's a really sensual book. Very satisfying read. And something that you just don't come across very often, and I really wanted to talk about that. So check it out. Briefly, A Delicious Life is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful book. Subscribe for books. That sound right? Oh, I'm sick, I don't know.